The auctioneer's hammer cracked like thunder against the wooden podium, but the silence that followed was deafening. Not a single hand had risen for lot number 47, a stocky, mud-caked stallion whose wild eyes blazed with defiance from the holding pen. His coat, thick with winter fur and scarred from countless battles with barbed wire, made him look more like a refugee from the wilderness than a horse worth bidding on. "Come now, folks," the auctioneer pleaded, his voice echoing through the dusty auction barn. "This here's a strong animal, just needs some work, that's all." But the crowd of ranchers, horse traders, and weekend cowboys remained unmoved, their attention already shifting to the sleeker animals waiting in the wings. Kestrel. Northfield sat in the back corner of the auction house, his weathered hands folded over the head of his walking stick. At 78, he'd seen more horse auctions than he cared to count, but something about this particular stallion made him lean forward in his creaking chair. The horse's nostrils flared as he paced the small enclosure, his hooves striking, the metal grating with sharp, rhythmic clangs that seemed to echo the rapid beating of his untamed heart. 1,500, anyone? 1,000? The auctioneer's desperation was becoming palpable. "This animal's got good bones, solid build." "He's half Mustang," someone called out from the crowd, the words dripping with disdain. "Probably caught, running wild up in the high country. You'd never break something like that." Kestrel's pale blue eyes narrowed as he studied the stallion more closely. The horse's head was broad and intelligent, his neck thick with muscle that spoke of endless miles covered across rough terrain. There were indeed scars, thin white lines that crisscrossed his dark bay coat like a map of survival. But it was the way the animal held himself that caught Kestrel's attention. Despite being trapped in the pen, despite the chaos and noise of the auction, the stallion maintained a dignity that couldn't be bought or sold. $500. The auctioneer tried again, his voice cracking slightly. Surely someone... The stallion suddenly stopped pacing and turned toward the crowd, as if searching for something or someone among the sea of faces. His ears pricked forward, and for a moment, the wild fire in his eyes seemed to dim to a curious glow. Kestrel felt an odd stirring in his chest, a recognition that transcended the ordinary boundaries between human and animal. "He's looking for his person," Kestrel murmured to himself, the words barely audible above the auctioneer's increasingly frantic attempts to generate interest. A younger man in the row ahead turned around with a smirk. "That nag's looking for the glue factory, old-timer. Best thing for an animal like that." But Kestrel wasn't listening anymore. He was watching the way the stallion's muscles trembled beneath his thick coat, not with fear, but with barely contained power. This wasn't a broken horse. This was a king without a kingdom, a warrior without a battle. And suddenly, Kestrel understood why he'd been drawn to attend this particular auction on this gray October morning. $250. The auctioneer called out desperately. Going once, going twice. Kestrel's weathered hand rose slowly into the air. The auction barn fell silent except for the stallion's heavy breathing and the creak of Kestrel's boots as he made his way down to the holding pen. Whispers followed. In his wake, questions about the crazy old man who'd just bought the wildest horse in 3 counties. But Kestrel paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on the dark bay stallion, who now stood perfectly still, watching his approach with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the mountains. "You're either brave or foolish, Kestrel," called out Vance Meridew, the auction house owner, as he approached with the paperwork. "That horse hasn't let anyone within 10 feet of him since we brought him in." Kestrel nodded absently, his attention fixed on the stallion. Up close, the horse was even more magnificent, and more damaged, than he'd appeared from the back of the barn. Fresh cuts marked his legs where he'd fought against the trailer during transport, and his ribs showed slightly through his thick coat, evidence of too many lean months in the wild. "What's his story?" Kestrel asked, though he didn't take his eyes off the horse. "Rounded up with a herd of Mustangs up near Devil's Canyon," Vance explained, shuffling through the documentation. "Bureau of Land Management contract. Most of the others sold easy enough. Younger, prettier animals, but this one..." He gestured helplessly. "Hell, Kestrel. He's probably 12, maybe 13 years old. That's ancient for a wild horse. And look at the size of him. Must be pushing 17 hands and built like a draft horse. Nobody wants something that's gonna eat them out of house and home. But Kestrel was no longer listening to Vance's litany of the stallion's supposed shortcomings. Something extraordinary was happening. As he stood quietly at the edge of the pen, the horse began to move toward him. Not with the aggressive posture he'd maintained throughout the auction, but with a curious, almost tentative gait. "I'll be damned," someone whispered from behind them. The stallion stopped just 3 feet from where Kestrel stood, his massive head lowered slightly as if in acknowledgement. For a long moment, the two simply regarded each other in silence. Then, without conscious thought, Kestrel pursed his lips and released a soft, melodic whistle. 3 ascending notes followed by a gentle trill, a sound he'd learned from his grandfather decades ago while working cattle in Montana. The effect was immediate and profound. The stallion's ears shot forward, his eyes widened with what could only be described as recognition, and he took the final step forward until his muzzle was almost touching the metal grating that separated them. A sound rumbled from deep in his chest, not quite a whinny, not quite a nicker, but something ancient and knowing. "How did you—" Vance began, but Kestrel held up a hand for silence. "He knows that song," Kestrel said quietly, wonder creeping into his voice. "Somebody taught him that song." The stallion's nostrils flared as he breathed in Kestrel's scent, and then something even more remarkable happened. The wild horse lowered his great head and gently touched his muzzle to Kestrel's outstretched palm through the metal bars. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up Kestrel's arm, not painful, but charged with possibility. "That's impossible," breathed Janessa Caldwell, the veterinarian who'd been examining horses for the auction. "Wild horses don't behave like this. They don't respond to human music." But even as she spoke, Kestrel whistled the tune again, and the stallion's response was even stronger. He lifted his head and released a long, haunting call that seemed to contain all the loneliness of the high desert, all the majesty of running free beneath endless skies. "He's not fully wild," Kestrel realized aloud. "Somebody broke him once. Somebody loved him." The paperwork was completed in a daze of speculation and wonder. As the crowd finally began to disperse, many pausing to stare at the unlikely pair, Kestrel remained at the pen, continuing his quiet conversation with the stallion through whistles and gentle words. "You got a name for him?" Vance asked as he handed over the ownership documents. Kestrel considered this, watching as the horse stood calmly now, no longer pacing or showing signs of distress. "Ranger," he said finally. "His name is Ranger." And somehow, impossible as it seemed, the stallion's ears perked up at the sound of that name, as if he remembered it from some half-forgotten dream. The trailer ride to Kestrel's ranch should have been a nightmare. Every other horse hauler in the county had warned him about transporting wild mustangs, the kicking, the panic, the potential for injury to both horse and human. But Ranger loaded into the trailer with surprising calm, following Kestrel's whistled tune like a song he'd been waiting years to hear again. Kestrel's property stretched across 200 acres of rolling Montana grassland, backed up against the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. It wasn't much by modern ranching standards, but it had been in his family for 4 generations, and every fence post and water trough held memories of horses he'd known and loved. As they pulled up the gravel drive, Kestrel could see his boarder, Collie, Echo, waiting on the porch with the patient dignity that farm dogs perfect over years of greeting returning masters. The unloading went smoother than anyone had a right to expect. Ranger backed out of the trailer with careful precision, his hooves finding purchase on the ramp as if he'd done this countless times before. But once his feet touched solid ground, everything changed. The stallion's head shot up, his nostrils flared wide, and he began to tremble, not with fear, but with something that looked almost like recognition. "Easy, boy," Kestrel murmured, but Ranger was already moving, pulling against the lead rope with gentle insistence. He wanted to explore, to investigate, to remember. Kestrel had planned to put him in the small paddock near the barn, a safe place where a potentially dangerous animal could be contained while they got to know each other. But something in Ranger's Demeanor made him reconsider. Instead, he led the stallion toward the larger pasture, the one that offered a clear view of the mountains and access to the creek that wandered through the property. As they walked, Echo fell into step beside them, her intelligent eyes fixed on the newcomer with curiosity rather than fear. Ranger acknowledged the dog with a brief glance, then returned his attention to the landscape around them, his behavior becoming more animated with each step. When they reached the gate to the main pasture, something extraordinary happened. Ranger stopped abruptly and turned to look directly at a weathered oak tree that stood sentinel near the creek. He stared at it for a long moment, then released a call that echoed across the valley, not the wild cry they'd heard at the auction, but something softer, more personal, almost like a greeting. "What is it, boy?" Kestrel asked, following the horse's gaze. The oak was old, probably planted by his grandfather, and its broad branches had provided shade for countless animals over the decades. But there was nothing obviously special about it, nothing that should capture a wild horse's attention so completely. Then Ranger began to move toward the tree, his steps quickening with purpose. Kestrel followed, his own heart beginning to race, as pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand began to shift into place. At the base of the oak, Ranger stopped and lowered his head to nose at something in the grass, something metal that caught the afternoon light. Kestrel knelt down and brushed away the fallen leaves, revealing a horseshoe, old and weathered but still recognizable. Engraved into the metal, barely visible after years of weather, were the initials RC, and below them the outline of a musical note. "Ranger's Cove," Kestrel whispered, the pieces suddenly clicking together. "You belong to Ridge Carmichael." The name hit him like a physical blow. Ridge Carmichael had been his neighbor 40 years ago, an old-timer even then who'd lived alone in a cabin up in the hills. Ridge had been known throughout the valley for his way with horses, particularly difficult, ones that other trainers had given up on. He'd had a gift for gentling wild things, and his methods had seemed almost magical to a young Kestrel who'd watched from afar. But Ridge had disappeared one winter, his cabin found empty, his horses gone. Some said he'd just moved on, following the old cowboy tradition of never staying in one place too long. Others whispered darker theories. The mystery had never been solved. "You were his horse," Kestrel said, reaching out to touch Ranger's neck. "You lived here once. That's why you knew the whistle. Ridge taught it to you." Ranger's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed his great head against Kestrel's chest and released a sound that was pure emotion, grief, longing, and something that might have been relief all wrapped together. He was home. After all these years running wild in the mountains, fighting to survive, he had finally come home. As the sun began to set behind the bitterroots, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kestrel removed Ranger's halter and watched as the stallion rolled in the familiar grass of his youth. For the first time since the auction, the horse looked truly at peace. "Welcome home, old friend," Kestrel whispered, and Echo barked once in agreement, as if sealing the promise that this homecoming would be permanent. The first month with Ranger was like watching a statue come to life. Each day brought small revelations as the stallion rediscovered aspects of his former self that had been buried beneath years of wild survival. He remembered where the best grass grew, which fence posts provided the perfect scratching spots, and how to position himself to catch the morning sun just right as it crested the eastern hills. But it was the music that truly unlocked his past. Kestrel had always been a whistler, a habit inherited from his grandfather, but he'd never imagined how profound an effect those simple melodies could have. Each tune seemed to trigger different memories in Ranger. The ascending three-note call brought him running from across the pasture. A gentle lullaby-like melody would calm him during thunderstorms, and a complex dancing tune that Kestrel had learned from an old Irish cowhand would cause Ranger to perform an elaborate series of movements that looked almost like choreographed steps. "It's like he's dancing," observed Dr. Janessa Caldwell during one of her visits to check on Ranger's progress. She'd become fascinated by the stallion's transformation and had taken to stopping by the ranch whenever her veterinary rounds brought her to the area. "I've never seen anything like it," Indeed, Ranger's physical transformation had been remarkable. The hollow look had left his eyes, replaced by an alert intelligence that seemed to catalog everything around him. His coat had begun to shine with proper nutrition and care, revealing a deep mahogany color shot through with darker bay markings. The scars remained, but they no longer looked like wounds. They were now simply part of his story, evidence of survival and strength. But it was his emotional healing that truly amazed everyone who witnessed it. The suspicious defensive horse from the auction had given way to an animal who seemed to understand that he was safe, that he was wanted, that he belonged somewhere again. One morning in late November, Kestrel discovered just how deep that sense of belonging ran. He'd been working in the barn, repairing a broken stall door, when Echo began barking frantically from the yard. Rushing outside, he found Ranger standing at the gate to the front pasture, his attention focused on something in the distance. 3 riders were approaching along the county road, strangers whose body language suggested they weren't just passing through. As they drew closer, Kestrel could see they were serious horsemen, the kind who carried themselves with the confidence that came from decades in the saddle. Their leader, a man with steel-gray hair and sun-weathered features, dismounted. As they reached the fence line, "You Kestrel Northfield?" the man asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp as they assessed both Kestrel and the stallion, who now stood protectively between them and the barn. "I am. What can I do for you?" "Name's Bronson Kemp. This here's my son Quade and my nephew, Tate." He gestured to the 2 younger men who remained mounted. "We're horse traders, work mostly with the government contracts. We heard you bought a Mustang at the Meridew auction last month." Kestrel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "That's right. What of it?" "Well, see, there's been some concern about the paperwork on that particular animal. Questions about whether he was actually part of the wild herd, or if maybe he belonged to someone before he got rounded up." Bronson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're prepared to make you a fair offer, double what you paid for him, save everyone a lot of trouble." "He's not for sale," Kestrel replied quietly, but his hand moved instinctively to rest on Ranger's neck. The stallion had grown tense, his muscles coiled as if preparing for flight or fight. "Now, Mr. Northfield, let's be reasonable." Quade spoke up from his saddle. "That's a valuable animal you've got there. Pure Mustang stallions with his bloodlines can bring serious money in the right markets. You're sitting on a gold mine, but—" Kestrel was no longer listening to their words. He was watching their horses, noting the way the animals shifted nervously beneath their riders, ears pinned back and eyes showing white around the edges. More telling was Ranger's reaction. The stallion was backing toward the barn, his head high and his nostrils flared wide, reading scents and intentions that humans couldn't perceive. "You boys need to move along," Kestrel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down everything from blizzards to bank foreclosures. "This horse is home and he's staying home." Bronson's expression hardened. "You might want to reconsider that position, old man. There are legal channels we can pursue if necessary." But before anyone could respond, Ranger did something that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Kestrel and the 3 strangers, and released a call that seemed to come from the very core of his being, a sound of challenge and warning that echoed across the valley like thunder. The strangers' horses shied backward, their riders fighting to maintain control. And in that moment, watching Ranger stand his ground to protect his home and his person, Kestrel understood that the healing process was complete. This wasn't just a horse anymore. This was family. Word traveled fast in ranch country, and by the end of the week, half the valley knew about the confrontation at Kestrel's place. The story grew with each telling, how the old man's Mustang had faced down 3 mounted riders like some kind of 4-legged guardian angel, how the horse had seemed to understand exactly what was at stake, how the bond between man and animal had proven stronger than legal threats and financial incentives. But Kestrel knew the Kemp family wouldn't give up easily. Men like Bronson didn't make idle threats, and there was something about their interest in Ranger that went beyond simple horse trading. They knew something about the stallion's history that they weren't sharing, and that knowledge made them dangerous. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Sheriff Deke Holloway pulled up the drive in his patrol car. Deke had been a friend of Kestrel's for 30 years, which made the uncomfortable expression on his face all the more concerning. "Afternoon, Kestrel," Deke said as he climbed out of his vehicle, his movements deliberately casual. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It was," Kestrel replied, leaning against the fence where Ranger stood watching the proceedings with alert interest. "What brings you out here, Deke?" "Well, I got some paperwork I need to show you. Seems there's been a complaint filed about that horse of yours." Deke pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Bronson Kemp claims he has evidence that your stallion was stolen property before he got rounded up with those Mustangs." Kestrel read through the legal document, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. According to Kemp's claim, Ranger was actually a registered quarter horse named Thunder Ridge that had been stolen from a ranch in Wyoming 3 years earlier. The paperwork looked official, complete with photographs and registration numbers. "This is garbage, Deke, and you know it," Kestrel said, handing back the papers. "That horse has been running wild for years. Look at him. Does he look like he's been living in someone's pasture?" Indeed, despite his remarkable recovery, Ranger still bore the unmistakable marks of his wild years. His hooves were hard as iron, from traversing rocky terrain. His coat showed the scars of survival, and his behavior still carried the wariness of an animal that had learned to trust no one. "I hear you, Kestrel, I really do," Deke said, his discomfort evident. "But the law's the law. I've got to follow proper procedure. Kemp's got a court order giving him the right to examine the horse, verify the markings described in his documentation." "Over my dead body," Kestrel said quietly, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. Before Deke could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the county road. 3 trucks were turning into the drive: Bronson, Kemp and his crew, along with what appeared to be a horse trailer and several men Kestrel didn't recognize. Ranger's reaction was immediate and electric. The stallion's head shot up, his ears pinned flat against his skull, and a sound emerged from his throat that was pure challenge. He began moving along the fence line, his gait fluid and powerful, like a wild thing preparing for battle. "Easy, boy," Kestrel murmured, but he could feel the tension radiating from the horse in waves. Bronson climbed out of the lead truck with the confident swagger of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Sheriff Holloway, thank you for facilitating this examination. We'll have this whole matter cleared up in no time." But as the group approached the pasture fence, something remarkable happened. Ranger positioned himself directly in front of where Kestrel stood and began to perform the dancing movements that Kestrel's whistling had first triggered. Without any musical cue, the stallion moved through the complex sequence of steps with perfect precision, side-passing, backing, executing a flawless pirouette, then rising into a controlled rear that showed off his massive chest and powerful hindquarters. "Well, I'll be damned," one of Kemp's men whispered. "That horse is trained to music." But Bronson's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Thunder Ridge was never trained to do liberty work." Dr. Janessa Caldwell chose that moment to arrive, her veterinary truck pulling up just as the tension reached its peak. She'd been monitoring Ranger's progress closely and had become something of an advocate for both horse and owner. "What's all this about?" she asked, taking in the crowd of men surrounding the pasture. Deke quickly explained the situation while Janessa examined Kemp's documentation. Her expression grew increasingly skeptical as she read. "These registration papers are for a horse born in 2018, she said finally. "But I've examined this stallion extensively. Based on his teeth and overall physical development, he's at least 15 years old, possibly older. This paperwork doesn't match this animal." The silence that followed was broken only by Ranger's gentle nickering as he approached the fence where Kestrel stood. The stallion lowered his great head and nuzzled his owner's shoulder with a tenderness that spoke of trust. "Absolute and unshakable. Seems to me," Deke said slowly, "that this horse knows exactly where he belongs, and it ain't in Wyoming. Bronson Kemp's confident expression had crumbled into something approaching desperation. "Now wait just a minute." But his protest was cut short by the arrival of one more vehicle, an old pickup truck that rattled and wheezed as it made its way up the drive. The man who emerged was ancient even by ranching standards, his movements careful but determined as he approached the group. "Heard there was some question about Ridge Carmichael's old horse," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the authority. "Of advanced age and hard-won wisdom. Name's Garrett Sinclair. I worked cattle with Ridge for 20 years before he disappeared." Garrett Sinclair moved with the deliberate pace of a man whose bones had endured 90-plus winters, but his eyes were sharp as he surveyed the assembled crowd. When his gaze fell on Ranger, something shifted in his weathered features. A recognition so profound it seemed to bridge the decades. "Holy Mother of Pearl," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's really you, isn't it, boy?" Ranger's response was immediate and overwhelming. The stallion pushed against the fence rails, stretching his neck as far as he could reach, whinnying with a sound that contained years of separation and loss. Garrett's weathered hand found the horse's muzzle, and the connection between them was electric. "This here horse's name is Ranger," Garrett announced to the assembled group, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Bred him myself from my best mare back in '82. Sold him as a yearling to Ridge Carmichael, who trained him to work cattle and perform to music. Ridge used to say this horse could dance to any tune you whistled, and damned if he wasn't right." Bronson Kemp stepped forward aggressively. "Now see here, old man." "I ain't finished." Garrett cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. "Ridge and Ranger worked this valley for 15 years. When Ridge disappeared that winter in '97, most folks figured his horses scattered to the wild, but I always wondered if maybe one of them survived out there in the high country." Dr. Caldwell is frantically taking notes. "Mr. Sinclair, would you be willing to provide documentation of the horse's breeding? Registration papers, vaccination records, anything that could establish provenance?" "Don't need papers to prove what's standing right in front of us," Garrett replied. "But yeah, I kept records. Got the whole bloodline documented back at my place." But it was Kestrel who provided the most compelling evidence. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the weathered horseshoe he'd found under the oak tree. "This was buried near the tree where I found him that first day. Ridge Carmichael's initials, and this musical note carved right into the metal." Sheriff Holloway examined the horseshoe carefully, then looked up at Bronson Kemp. "Mr. Kemp, I'm afraid your documentation doesn't hold water. This horse clearly has a documented history in this valley that predates your claim by decades." "This is ridiculous," Kemp exploded. "That animal is worth a fortune. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Deke interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "And I am. This complaint is dismissed. You boys need to pack up and move along." But Ranger wasn't finished making his point. As the Kemp crew began loading their equipment back into their trucks, the stallion moved to the center of the pasture and began to perform the most elaborate sequence of movements anyone had ever seen him execute. Without any musical accompaniment, he moved through what could only be described as a celebration, leaping, spinning, executing perfect flying lead changes as he circled the field. "He's dancing," Dr. Caldwell breathed. "He's actually dancing." Kestrel couldn't help but smile as he watched his horse's joyful display. On impulse, he began to whistle the complex Irish tune that had always triggered Ranger's most sophisticated responses. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and his movements became even more precise, more artistic, as if the music was giving form to emotions too large for words. As the sun began to set behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky, in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the last of the unwanted visitors finally departed. Garrett Sinclair remained, sharing stories of Ridge Carmichael and the horses they'd known, while Echo chased shadows in the growing dusk. "You know," Garrett said as they watched Ranger graze peacefully in the pasture, "Ridge used to say that some horses choose their people just as much as people choose their horses. Said Ranger here was the smartest animal he'd ever worked with, had a sense about people that was almost supernatural." Kestrel nodded, understanding flooding through him. He chose to come home. After all those years running wild, he found his way back to where he belonged. More than that, Garrett replied with a knowing smile. He chose you to bring him home. Ridge would have liked that. He always said the best horsemen were the ones who listened more than they talked, who understood. That partnership was more important than dominance. As if summoned by their conversation, Ranger lifted his head from the grass and walked over to where the men stood by the fence. He nuzzled Kestrel's shoulder gently, then turned his attention to Garrett, allowing the old man to scratch behind, his ears in the way that horses everywhere recognize as the deepest sign of affection. "Welcome home, old friend," Kestrel whispered, and this time the words carried the weight of permanence, of belonging, of a journey finally completed. In the distance, a lone coyote called across the valley, its voice carrying on the evening wind. Ranger's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but he didn't move from his place beside the fence, beside the people who had recognized him for what he truly was. Not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a soul seeking home. The stars began to emerge, the darkening sky, and somewhere in the mountains that had sheltered him during his years of exile, the wind whispered through the pines like a gentle lullaby. The thick wild horse that no one had wanted at the auction had found his way back to the music that had shaped his youth, back to the land that had called to him across the years, back to a love that had never forgotten his name. And in that moment, as the last light faded from the western sky, everything was exactly as it should be.